Glory to Jesus Christ, and welcome back to Social Ethics. Today we're going to talk about property rights in Orthodox social ethics, and we're going to explore what the church has to say in her tradition about property rights, and we'll look at some of the biblical and patristic teaching, as well as look at the canonical tradition, and hopefully as well as the role of the state in securing and property rights and keeping them within their appropriate moral limits. So let's begin if we can. Here's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at what are property rights, first of all. Then we're going to look at the importance of the relationship between wealth and freedom as the context within which, as contemporary Orthodox Christians, we exercise our property rights and think about them. We'll look at property rights in the canonical tradition, and then we will look at property rights in recent magisterial teaching, specifically for the life of the world and the basis of the social concept. And then we'll end with that. So let's begin with property rights, biblical and patristic teaching. What are the church father? What does the scriptures and the fathers say about property? You know, our Savior, Jesus, Lord and God and Savior Jesus Christ, repeatedly points to the relative nature of the right of property in his parables on the vineyard let out to be used, on talents distributed among many, and on an estate handed over for temporary management, expressing the idea inherent in the church that God is the absolute owner of everything. St. Basil the Great says, tell me, what do you have that is yours? Wherefrom did you take it and bring it to life? So there are two things. The scriptures clearly assume that there are such things as property rights, and that it's fundamentally a good thing, but it's not something that we have without any moral obligation. So our property rights exist within a particular moral context. St. Basil the Great pushes that a little bit further, and he says, all right, when you think about your possessions, which of all of your possessions, what did you actually create ex nihilo, from nothing? And so we discover that there's not only a moral limit about the use of property, but there's also some ontological limits about the nature of property itself. And fundamentally, that limit is that I didn't make the things that over which I claim ownership or stewardship. So what are property rights? Well, essentially, property rights are a bundle of rights, and you'll hear me use the phrase property rights throughout this entire lecture, because it's not just that we have something called a property right, but rather we have what lawyers and economists call a bundle of rights. In other words, property rights are made up of many things. There is, for example, the right of possession. In other words, the legal owner of the property has just owns the property. It's my house. Then there is the right of control. The owner of the property can prescribe what activity takes place on the property, such as buildings or operating a business. This is all, sometimes this can be shared with another owner or the government or an organization, but the idea is that if I own this property, I get to use it the way that I choose to use it. Then there is the right of exclusion, which is to say that the owner of this property is able to prohibit others from entering the property. Right of enjoyment, the owner is able to use the property as he sees fit, including activities such as I can live there, or I can mine the land for minerals, or I can farm. All of these are part and parcel of my property rights. And then finally, there's the right of disposition. I can set, or sometimes called the right of alienation. I can sell the property, I can give it away, I can bequeath it to someone in my will. But fundamentally, what this is all getting at is the property is mine to do with as I see fit. The reason that this is important, especially for us as Orthodox Christians, is that we have right of property over our church buildings. So if the parish or the diocese owns the building, then it has all of these rights. Not only do the parish own the building, but it gets to determine what the building is used for. It gets to say who can come in and who can come out. It's able to enjoyment. Basically, you can get something satisfactory from the property, and then, for example, worship, and then disposition. It belongs to the parish, or actually, strictly speaking, the diocese, to determine or to sell the property should that be necessary. So just to go back and, however, to remember, or just to review something that we've said before, is that when we're talking about property rights in an American context, we're talking about the rights of the church in a period of unprecedented wealth and broad cultural and political freedoms. One of what's important there, and I've mentioned this again before, is that while we have a well-developed ethic for poverty and persecution, wealth and liberties really do seem to have undone us. Think, for example, about all the lawsuits over the years that have been brought when people are trying to fight over ownership of church buildings. This is just not a good use of our freedom and our wealth, but it happens. So, it's incumbent upon us to learn how to use the wealth that we have in a way that advances the gospel. And this is especially true in all things as it pertains to the church's property. But in order to do that, we really have to have a critical, I'd say, holistic analysis of property in the moral tradition of the church. Without this good understanding of how historically, how in the tradition we understand property, we risk subverting Jesus's words to us that we must be in the world, but not of the world. Church history offers us both caution and hope as we reflect on how the church can manage the material blessings that God has poured out on us. If I know, Father John, you're in a parish, Deacon Basil, you've been in a parish, Makola, you hope to be in a parish. At some point, all of you have or will have to work with a parish board of administration or a parish council who are responsible for overseeing the material goods of the church. Well, trying to understand the limits of how we can use our property rights is important, or you're going to have all sorts of arguments. We see parishes turned into saloons, casinos, and while there's the legal right to do that in most states, the question is whether or not we have a moral right. So we got to learn how to use the wealth that we have, and especially the wealth that of our property. And this is maybe the first thing that I need to say, is that we need, as human beings, as Orthodox Christians, more than wealth. If you're wondering, that picture is Glendalough, which is where St. Kevin, the great Irish monastic saint, lived and preached. I actually was there a number of years ago, and I managed to talk to an Orthodox priest from Romania who brought his parish there and actually celebrated the first divine liturgy in St. Kevin's church in over 1,000 years. Anyway, we need more than wealth, and Rune Church is probably the best example that wealth is not necessarily enduring. Wealth passes away, even material wealth. To get at this idea a little bit more directly, there's a lovely book by Peter Brown called Through the Eye of a Needle: Wealth, the Fall of Rome, and the Making of Christianity in the West, 350 to 550 AD. In this, Brown writes that long after the empire vanished, fiscal privileges inherited from imperial times and renewed by local kings remained crucial to the social position of the churches. He concludes by observing that landed wealth in and of itself, however, was not enough. Though the dioceses and monastic communities had, by the end of the 6th century, amassed a great deal of wealth, what mattered most was the ability of church leaders, whether clerical or lay, to use that wealth in a manner harmonious with the gospel. Brown suggests that it is because of what today we call property rights the church was able to succeed in its evangelistic mission. And again, this is something that if we think about for a moment, makes perfectly good sense. We exercise our property rights in putting up church buildings, but there's the seminary, the diocesan center, the cultural center. All of these have their role to play in advancing the gospel. And they're able to advance the gospel, and the church is able to use them to advance the gospel because we own them. They're ours. And as a matter of law, we can use them according to our own wishes. So, property rights are not something really secondary or marginal. They really strike at the heart of how we are going to go about evangelizing. But property rights are also one of the ways in which we secure our liberty as Orthodox Christians. I get to say to the state, this is my church, stay out. You can't tell me what to preach. You can't tell me how to worship God. You can't tell me, who can or can't serve in the altar. All of that is outside the authority of the government, and that's the case as a matter of law because we have property rights. All right, so let's go on a little bit. So let's look now, if we can, at property rights in the canonical tradition of the church. A right that can't be enforced is not particularly valuable. It's not particularly useful. The canons of the church assume a basic right to property, and they sketch out how that right is to be enforced and exercised. Let me just offer one example, and that's from the canons of the Holy Apostles, where we hear about the relationship between the bishop's personal property and the property of the diocese. We discover in the canon that it is very important to distinguish the private goods of the bishop from those of the church. While the bishop holds the goods of the church in trust for the good of all, he nevertheless retains the power over his own goods when he dies, and so he's able to leave that to whomever he wills and how he wills. Moreover, the bishop's own property may not be lost under pretense of it belonging to the church. In other words, from the very, very early on, there was this understanding that, look, the bishop is going to have property. We need to protect that property. We need to not mingle it with the property of the church. Those need to be held separate as a matter of law. And again, this is something that you see later under Constantine, that often monastic communities would incorporate their monasteries, that is, set them up as a corporation under imperial law in a way that left them independent from the diocese. So the monastery would own its own property, not the diocese. What's interesting here is that frequently the abbot of the monastery would also be the diocesan bishop. So he would make sure that the monastery was not owned by the diocese. And he did that so that the monastery could remain independent. In other words, there wouldn't be people who would begin to interfere in the life of the monastery. That, to my way of thinking, that's really quite an extraordinary notion, but that they would use imperial law to secure the independence of the monastery from interference by the empire, by the diocese, or frankly, even the family of the monastics. So our monastic tradition exists, at least in part, because of very strong property rights during the imperial era. So let's go on. Respecting the property rights of both the individual, in this case, the bishop, is fundamentally a matter of justice. The bishop has an obligation to care for, during these days, his wife or children, or maybe he has his parents or siblings or servants. So defending property rights in the canons isn't simply a matter of justice for the bishop. It's also a matter of doing justice for the diocese. It is just before God and man, we read in the canon, that neither should the church suffer any loss through ignorance of the bishop's own property, nor the bishop or his relations be injured under pretext of the church. In other words, the bishop owns what he owns, and he should be able to use it the way he sees fit. That's just a matter of justice. But it also becomes a matter of charity, because if we deny the bishop or we deny the individual the right to use his property as he sees fit, then we take from him the ability to use his property, not just buildings, but also material wealth, for the sake of the poor, or as his conscience dictates. And this is very important. Property rights secure your ability to care for the people that you think God would have you care for. Your families, our families first of all, but also, different groups of people that we meet in the community. Maybe they're Orthodox, maybe they're not. We support, we get to support who we wish, and neither the state nor the church, neither the state as a matter of civil law, nor the church as a matter of canon law, can tell me how I have to use my funds. As long as I'm using my funds, my wealth, in a way which is not contrary to the gospel, it's not the church's business. Even though I'm a priest, I get to write a check to whomever I wish to write. Finally, though, and this is come back, I'll just keep coming back to this for the whole rest of the semester. So if you haven't figured it out yet, this is a theme for me. Finally, and as we've seen in other contexts, property rights and their defense has implications for the evangelical witness of the church. Those who belong to him should not be involved in contests and cast approaches upon his death. In other words, that's sort of a very awkward way to put it. One of the reasons that it's important to respect property rights, not only morally, but as a matter of law, is so that Christians don't go to court having arguments over what we should do with the bishop's property or our parents' property. That's not something that third parties should have. The third parties don't have a voice in that. It belongs to the individual, whether the individual is a bishop or a layperson. It belongs to the community, whether it's a diocese or a monastery. So property rights, not only serve the demands of justice and charity, by making all of this very clear out at the beginning, it also keeps us from this very this very disturbing, scandalous situation of Christians taking each other to court over material goods. So again, property rights way more important than just owning a house. So let's move on a little bit, and let's move now to some recent to the recent magisterial teaching, magisterial documents on property rights. And first, we're going to go to For the Life of the World. We'll come to the basis of the social concept in a moment, but I wanted to start with the life For the Life of the World, even though it's the later document. And one of the things that I notice in For the Life of the World, is that the authors are not particularly interested in property rights. While they acknowledge that there is a right to property, the majority, their emphasis is really on how all the goods of creation are the common property of all humanity. And as part of that, there is a conversation about the general right of the wealthy to care for those in need. In other words, For the Life of the World is more interested in talking about moral responsibility of wealth, how we should not exploit the poor. In fact, it's one of the few, exploitation of the poor is one of the few times in the document where, actually it's the only time in the document where they use the word damnation. Profiting from the poor, they say, leads to damnation. Likewise, the failure to share our wealth, that means not sharing money with the hungry is a very serious sin. And for the fathers of the church, not just neglect, but actually murder. Now, all of this is fundamentally true. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that. But as we saw a moment ago, it all assumes that I have not only moral responsibility for my material wealth, but also some control over that wealth in a way which is independent from third parties. In other words, neither the state nor the church can tell me how specifically I'm supposed to fulfill my moral obligation. If I don't have control over my wealth, then over my property, then I can't have any. There can't be any moral obligation to disperse it, to use that wealth in a manner which is, for the sake of the gospel. If it's not mine, I can't say how it's used. So that's one of the things that's sort of implicit. They really, though, don't really highlight or discuss much property rights as such. The other problem, though, that I want to point out in For the Life of the World, and if you haven't guessed, it really is not necessarily one of my favorite documents. I think it's, especially when it gets to matters of economics, public policy, so things that touch on my area, the social sciences, it is really very, very uneven. It is true that for the fathers of the church, everything that exists, the whole creation, is for the common good. That's certainly the case. In Catholic social thought, you'll hear the phrase the universal destination of goods. In other words, everything that we have is meant for all of us. Creation is a gift to the whole human family, not just one individual. The problem with that is that it leaves unexamined what economists call the tragedy of the commons. And there's a little graphic up there that gives you an idea. Let's imagine that we're shepherds. We each own 2 or 3 sheep, and we have this this pasture land that is between all our properties. All our properties are, in other words, around this great pasture land. And every day we bring our sheep out to graze. Now, I graze my sheep, you graze your sheep. The problem is that if each of us is just grazing his sheep, there's a very good likelihood that in time, especially as the sheep multiply, that the grazing land, the pasture land, will be destroyed. The interesting thing here is, for the pasture land to be destroyed and so lost to all of us, doesn't require that any of us are selfish. We all are simply pursuing our own morally good self-interest. The problem of the tragedy of the commons, and where things like property rights become important, is that I need to be able to coordinate with the other shepherds in a way that is just to all of us. So if all of us own everything, then as a practical matter, none of us own anything, because none of us really have any incentive to take responsibility for it. If you've ever lived with roommates, you know this is the case. It's very difficult to make sure that the kitchens get clean. I know when I was in college and graduate school, the guys I lived with were often slobs, so I would end up cleaning the kitchen, because for the simple reason that I couldn't stand a dirty kitchen. Still can. If I cook dinner, when dinner's on the table, the kitchen is clean. That's just how I cook. But the dirty kitchen with the roommates or the bathrooms not getting clean. That's an example of the tragedy of the commons. And what property rights do is help provide some practical limits to the use of property so that it remains available. Because the fact of the matter is, if I'm grazing my sheep and I get them, they're nice, healthy, fat sheep, then I have wool that I can sell, I have meat that I can sell, and that really is to everyone's advantage. But that doesn't happen unless there's some sort of coordination. I hope that makes sense. So anyway, let's go on to the basis of the social concept, which, like I said, has a much more extensive treatment of property rights. One of the things that we hear in the basis is where property rights come from, but also there's a discussion of the limits of property rights, as well as an overview of the different kinds of property that there are, and the role of the state and the church in securing rights. So it really is a much better treatment of property rights in my humble opinion. So where do property rights come from? Well, they are the fruit of human labor. It's interesting here that in the basis of the social concept, they essentially adopt the Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment author John Locke's argument about property rights. John Locke, for those of you who are history buffs, is one of the seminal figures in American constitutional law and the Declaration of Independence. Originally, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was life, liberty, and property. And Locke is one of the founding philosophical voices for the American Republic. So there's this interesting convergence between American political philosophy and Orthodox social teaching. But Locke's argument was very simple, and it's one that is repeated in the basis, is that when the person mixes his labor with natural resources, it affirms property as, and now I'm quoting from the basis, as a socially recognized form of people's relation to the fruits of labor and to natural resources. In other words, property is analogous to wages. Just like the workman is worth his wages, so the workman is worth property. It's not just that we should acquire monetary rewards for our work. It's also legitimate and even desirable to have, to create property from our labor, houses, art, automobiles, whatever it is. And again, like contemporary economic theory, the basis teaches that property rights are in fact a bundle of rights. Specifically, this means that the owner has not only owns the property and can use the property and can control the property and can collect income from the property, but he can also dispose of the property, lease it, modify it, or even liquidate it, simply to destroy it. It is the owner's to do with as he sees best. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that our property rights are without moral limits. And by the way, this is not just Orthodox social ethics, it's also in Locke. For Locke, individuals' property rights are legitimate, but the individual's exercise of those rights are conditioned on there being enough for the common good, enough and as good left in common for others. In other words, I get to own stuff, but I can't own so much stuff that I rob or I keep other people from having what they need. So, I mean, that's it. I just can't be greedy. And when I am, then there is, at a minimum, there's a moral obligation for me to change. But it also becomes potentially a moral obligation of the state to act. But we'll get to that in just a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about Christian attitudes towards property and the basis. Like I said, the basis has its own version of Locke's conditions on property rights. After affirming the moral and soteriological importance and limitations of the material dimension of human life, the reader is reminded that the attitude of Orthodox Christians to property should be based on the gospel's principle of love of one's neighbor, expressed in the words of the Savior, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another." This commandment is the basis of Christian moral behavior. So, yes, I own things, but I have to use the things that I have, not only for my own benefit, but also for the benefit of others, and not just the benefit of my loved ones, my immediate family, for example. Caring for my family is really an extension of caring for myself. Again, morally legitimate, good thing. In fact, St. Paul says that, widows who are in need really should first go to their families. St. John Chrysostom says that we should work hard enough and save so that we don't become a burden on the charity of the church. We have an obligation to care for ourselves and care for our family members, but after that's been met, we also have an obligation to care for others. To be sure, no one can tell us how much or how little, at least as long as what we're doing is morally correct and legal. But that we do have that obligation to use our property for the care of others. But this requires, again, a respect in civil and canon law for property. Let me see if I can just make this big so I don't block everything. Okay, there we go. And so for both Christians and others of goodwill, the regulation of interpersonal relationships, including property, the basis says, is not simply a practical matter, but a moral imperative. It is something that must be done not simply out of concern for a just society, but also from love, because justice and love or at least should be, the fruit of humanity's gratitude to God. Defending rights and using our property rightly glorifies God. This means that while we have a right to property, this right is only relative, not absolute. Property rights, like all rights, exist within a larger moral context defined by justice, charity, and gratitude. So what I'm getting at precisely this, and it's a repeat of what I said a little bit earlier. The reason that civil law and canon law have to respect a personal right to property and a corporate right to property is because without this right, then we cannot do the works of justice and mercy. We cannot be charitable if we have no freedom to use our property as we see fit. Full stop. As a matter of law, civil and canon, I need to be free to own things and to do with them as I see fit. And if I don't have that freedom, then we're kind of back to the situation, the tragedy of the commons. Things are not going to be done in a way which are for the common good, not out of malice, but simply out of a lack of coordination, lack of each of us exercising things as we see fit. It's just going to be a mess. Is really what it comes down to. So let me go on. I think you've got that point. You probably have. You're bright guys. So not only do we have to have sort of a general organization of property in civil law and canon law, we also have to understand that there are various forms of ownership, all of which are meant to serve justice and charity, and so are essential to a rightly ordered society. And these are some of the different kinds of ownership. You'll see that in the graph: public ownership, corporate private ownership, mixed forms of ownership, intellectual property rights. All of these are different ways in which property is organized. Public ownership, you know what that is. That's a library, that's City Hall, that's the District of Columbia, that's our state capitals. Corporate private ownership, which means people band together and they own something in common, like a business. But a church is also a corporate private ownership model, as an example of corporate private ownership. There are mixed forms of ownership where, say, the government and the state and individuals work together, say, to create a food bank. One really quick example, or actually, this is a very strange one, but a condo. A condominium is actually a mixed form of ownership. The tenants in the different condos are actually co-owners of the property. But so the tenants have a ownership stake in the property, but so does a corporation. So it's not just the aggregate of tenants; it's the tenants in collaboration with the property owner. And finally, there is intellectual property rights. I publish a lot, and that's mine, and someone can't claim it for themselves. They have to cite me. They have to say, "Hey, this came from Gregory Jensen. This is mine." But music, art, there are all sorts of intellectual property rights, and what we mean by that is intellectual is not just academic, but more broadly, anything that we create is, by virtue of that fact, ours. And again, all of this, though, all of these forms of property are just the fruits of human labor, and so that it's a matter of justice. They need to be protected, but they're also rooted in gratitude and respect gratitude to the Creator for creating, and then respect for human freedom and creativity. So when we denigrate or we downplay the importance of property rights, what we're really doing is showing a lack of gratitude to God, but also a lack of respect to human freedom and creativity. Property represents one of these great embodiments of synergy between God and between creature and creator. All right, let's go on a little bit. I don't want to go too much longer. The state has a moral obligation to do more than simply protect an individual or community's right to property. As with law more generally, the legal protection of private property, really can advance the gospel. This happens not only by turning the world lying in evil into the kingdom of God, but by preventing it from turning into hell. In other words, there is a positive good for the gospel found in property rights. So, and again, I mentioned it before. Simply, the easiest example is the existence of churches. That helps us advance the gospel. The state, by respecting the church's property rights, actually participates or shares in the proclamation of the gospel. We need to be, however, careful, and again, as in other areas, where human law completely rejects the absolute divine norm, replacing it by an opposite. When this happens, the basis says, it ceases to be law and becomes lawlessness in whatever legal garment it may dress itself. For example, the Ten Commandments say, honor your father and mother. Any secular norm that contradicts this commandment indicts not its offender, but the legislator itself. In other words, the human law has never contained the divine law in its fullness, but in order to remain law, it is obligated to conform to the God-established principles rather than erode them. So, in other words, the church or the state can't simply do whatever it wants with property. It needs to respect the property right, it has to respect private property. And if you recall that, the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate in 2000 were all men who came of age under the Soviet Union. You understand why they say these things. They had living experience of the state, taking the church's property and doing with it as it sees fit. They did this by an appeal to what in common law is called eminent domain. In the case of property, respecting God's law means rejecting the alienation and redistribution of property in ways that violate the rights of its legitimate owners. While an exception can be made based on the law, eminent domain, when it is necessary for the common good for the state to take ownership of a piece of property, this must be done carefully and with respect for the demands of justice and charity rooted in thankfulness to God. Otherwise, as Russian and American history has shown, the state's violation of these principles can and will result in social upheaval and people's suffering. If you take my house away from me, I'm going to be angry at you. If you say, hey, you have, we're going to put people here, we're going to quarter soldiers, or we're going to require that more people live in your house than you would have, that causes social unrest. So that has to be respected. So let me just, I think we're coming up to the very last. Yeah, I want to say just one thing about social donations, about church donations and taxation from the basis. And I have to admit, this is something that concerns me. It's another one of those little hints that there is a sort of a in some of the church's social teaching, and I'm in the basis. They describe a donation to the church as a special case of economic and social relations that should not be made automatically subject to the laws regulating finances, in particular public taxation. Rather solemnly, they conclude, the church declares that the income drawn from entrepreneurial activities can be taxed, but any encroachment on the donation of believers is a crime before people and God. Okay, deep breath here. What are they saying? They're saying that if I make a donation to the church, it's not the state's business to look at that donation. The state has no business in that. Well, that's lovely as long as I'm a good person. But the fact of the matter is this also sets up an opportunity not only for fraud on the part of the church, but money laundering. It's a way of organized crime. Cleaning its money, taking dirty money and making it clean money by donating it to the church, and then the church funneling it back in one means or another to the donor. Now, of course, that's never happened. That's something that has never, ever happened in the history of the church. It certainly has never happened with the Church of Russia. Okay, yeah, it did happen. So we just want to keep that in mind, that even though there's this great stuff in the basis and in the fathers of the church and for the life of the world, even there's great stuff, there are these blind spots that we need to be attentive to. All right, well, I'm coming up on 45 minutes. I'm going to stop now. Just a reminder, Saturday, November 9th, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, 1 p.m. Mountain, we have our video chat. That will be 50 minutes, so we'll start on time, we'll end on time. Hope next week to get everybody's essays back to them. If you owe me essays, get them to me sooner rather than later. The ones I've read so far have been good. Certainly B work at least, but on average anyway. So, but get those essays to me, and I'll get my comments back to you. And if you want, you are free to rewrite anything. If you say, hey, I got a B, I want an A. What do I need to do to get an A? Okay. Write something better, rewrite it, get the A. No skin off my nose. In fact, see, from my point of view, I feel like success if you put in the extra work to make a C into a B and a B into an A. So that's not grade inflation. That's earning the grade. All right, guys, I got to go. I'll look forward to talking to you later. Take care. God bless you all, and pray for me. All right. Bye-bye.